China, Taiwan, North Korea, Japan, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, the United States, the United Kingdom, Sweden, among other nations, are all posturing for war or they're at war. And it's escalating, my friends. What's going on? Well, Jesus said in the last days there's going to be a time of wars and rumors of wars. Now, there's always been wars and rumors of wars. But in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24, he's talking about an escalation and frequency of these things. He said that there's going to be, for example, earthquakes and volcanoes while all these other things are taking place. There's going to be a coalescing of end-time events.
Now to the Pentagon, where senior U.S. officials tell NBC News the Biden administration is increasingly concerned about the alliance between Russia and North Korea as the U.S. braces for potentially intensifying military actions from the countries ahead of the November election.
Katie, is a new world order taking shape?
So, yeah, I think the Chinese are setting up the new global world order that's going to rest on China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, whatever they can pick up in the BRICS and the global south, and then they'll reset the rules of the international rules-based order.
What has brought them together, quite frankly, it is what you're suggesting is a new world order.
Russia has now officially called the United States an enemy nation. This came from the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. Let me read out the translation of what he said. And we are an enemy country for them, much like they are for us. Again, that was the Kremlin spokesperson, and this is the first time he's said enemy, because it's not something to be said lightly. Barely 3 months ago, he said that the US was not the enemy, that Russia did not have any anti-American sentiments. But that has changed now. Why? Perhaps because of last week's escalation. Last week, the United States gave Ukraine a green light to strike Russian territory using American weapons. Ukraine has already begun doing so. They're using American weapons to strike inside Russia, and Russia is furious. Putin says Ukraine is striking Russian territory with the help of Western specialists.
While the fighting intensifies along Ukraine's eastern front, Russian President Vladimir Putin is issuing another ominous warning to the West. This time, it's over American-made missiles being used to strike targets inside Russia. Those strikes are now reportedly underway, prompting Putin to threaten to supply Russian allies with weapons to strike Western targets. He also repeated his warning that he'll turn to Russia's nuclear arsenal if he feels threatened.
We have our nuclear doctrine. Look at what is written there. If someone's action threatens our sovereignty, we consider it possible to use all means at our disposal.
Putin is claiming the war would end quickly if the West stopped sending military aid to Ukraine, but that's not likely to happen soon. Both NATO and the White House vowing to stay in the fight despite the new warnings from the Kremlin.
This is a war of aggression, and Ukraine has, according to international law, the right to defend themselves. And we have the right to provide support to Ukraine.
President Biden trying to cool tensions, saying Thursday the strikes are for the limited purpose of defending Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest city, and they won't be used offensively.
On the anniversary of D-Day, Russia was making new friends and new threats. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was the backdrop to Vladimir Putin's latest verbal volley that Russia could send missiles to other nations to target the West.
We are thinking that if they consider it possible to deliver such weapons to the combat zone, to launch strikes on our territory and create problems for us, why don't we have the right to supply weapons of the same type to some regions of the world where they can be used to launch strikes on sensitive facilities of the countries that do it to Russia?
I wanted to ask you about Ukraine. I know for years you resisted the idea of American weapons being used for any sort of direct strike inside Russia. But we did witness this shift in recent days, authorizing American weapons for limited direct strikes. Are American weapons being used right now inside Russia?
They're authorized to be used in proximity to the border. We're not authorizing strikes 200 miles into Russia. We're not authorizing strikes on Moscow, on the Kremlin.
Let me ask you about what Vladimir Putin said last night about this authorization of American weapons inside Russia. He said the supply of high-precision weapons to Ukraine for strikes on Russian territory is direct participation in this war. He went on to say that this is the way to serious problems, and again talked about Russia's nuclear capabilities. Does that concern you?
I've known him for over 40 years. He's concerned me for 40 years. He's not a decent man, he's a dictator, and he's struggling to make sure he holds this country together while still keeping this assault going.
Okay, Michael, what do you make of Biden's decision? Is it good for Ukraine and the world or not?
This is a disaster. It's a real danger. Can you imagine if Vladimir Putin authorized proxy forces to fire Russian-made missiles into the United States?
What are the consequences?
We would have to retaliate, right? What is Biden pushing us into? This is insane. I support Ukraine. I support Ukraine's right to fight, and I supported arming Ukraine, but I wanted a strategy. You can't fight a war without a strategy, and the Biden administration has no strategy. It's just like, send more money. What you just had just a minute ago, the administration, NATO will spend whatever it takes for as long as it takes. This is Vietnam nonsense. This is crazy. This is all protracted warfare that democracies never win.
So we're looking at escalation, inevitably, as a result of this. What do you think is going to happen with this, Michael?
Nothing good.
Okay, so we've got foreign ministers meeting in Geneva, and they seem to suggest they're also ready to bring Ukraine into NATO. Would that happen before the end of the war? Could it be a point of negotiation with Russia to end the conflict? What are your thoughts?
This is making it even worse because first, there's been no national debate about expanding NATO to Ukraine, right? About putting our continental nation, our country, on as a nuclear target in defense of Ukraine. This is insanity.
2 days ago, Putin warned the West that he would strategically position weapons in countries bringing the West within its striking range. It did not take the Russian leader too long to act. It is the 7th of June 2024 and the world is staring at what could possibly be another Cuban crisis. You heard that right. Russian warships are all set to dock in Havana. Have a look at what Cuba has told the world. It says a group of Russian ships will be visiting Havana next week. These are not your luxury cruise ships, by the way. These are Russian naval ships. The question is, what will these warships do in Cuba? Will they send a message to the US and the NATO? Russia and Cuba, remember, are Cold War allies. Cuba hosted Soviet nuclear missiles in 1962. The John F. Kennedy-led US administration decided to impose a naval blockade around Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis nearly tipped the world into a nuclear war. 62 years on, Russian nuclear-powered submarine has made a port call in Havana.
Now, Russia regularly conducts drills in America's backyard, but this time they're expected to be quote-unquote heightened. And the drills will continue for weeks, if not months. This is clearly muscle flexing. Russia wants to show that even while it is busy with Ukraine, it has firepower to spare, and that it can hurt any enemy anywhere in the world. All of this posturing is reminiscent of a different era, of the Cold War, when Russia and the US were constantly on the brink of war, and the rest of us were hoping to not be caught in the nuclear fallout.
Taiwan's Ministry of Defense is responding to a number of Chinese military drills carried out in their airspace. On social media, China says it's testing its ability to seize power. Taiwan claims 49 Chinese planes entered their airspace Thursday as nearly 20 warships were detected in the Taiwan Strait.
Officials are bracing for the possibility that North Korea could engage in more provocative military action than the U.S. and the world have seen in the last decade. This could be everything from more missile tests with demonstrating new advanced technologies to even another nuclear test. It would be their 7th under this regime, or the possibility of some sort of aggressive action against South Korea. They're bracing for this in part because it's an election year. During election years, historically, North Korea has conducted more provocative activity, but they are also looking at the fact that North Korea now has this increasing, strengthening relationship with Russia.
Australia has joined global condemnation of China's aggressive military response to the inauguration of Taiwan's new president.
5 Chinese military exercises around the main island, another 4 around Taiwan-controlled islands. Taipei scrambling its own jets in response. US, Japanese and Australian forces monitoring closely.
A delicate peace looks a little more fragile. The self-governed island has a new leader, one China sees as a reckless separatist. For 2 days, Beijing tried to show the world how it could and would wage and win a war here.
Preparing for a possible future confrontation with Taiwan, which China regards as a breakaway province, and has vowed to unify with the mainland.
Do you think conflict with China is a real possibility?
China is huge. Taiwan is just such a tiny place. One lake in China is 10 times bigger than Taiwan. Do you think this land is of any benefit to them?
But to Beijing, it is critical. Reunification inevitable. The latest drills, punishment for Taiwan talking about 2 separate countries.
China's military released this chilling computer animation, a warning of what it could do. With the largest navy in the world, rockets rain down on Taiwan. We see the island surrounded on every side until it is taken. Taiwan has scrambled its military in response.
Do you think that Beijing is preparing for war?
Certainly, yes. China is preparing for war. Based on the number of military ships and the hiring of new recruits, it's all for self-defense and Taiwan.
You remember the last time they did these drills was back in August 2022 when Nancy Pelosi famously did that visit to Taiwan. But Xi Jinping has been hosting President Putin in a sort of state visit only last week. They've talked about their sort of limitless partnership. Now, Xi Jinping wants to change the world order, the US-led world order. That resonates with President Putin. Also, China's very interested in how Putin's getting on with the invasion of Ukraine.
We can reveal that we have evidence that Russia and China are collaborating on combat equipment for use in Ukraine. Now, let's not forget that China said, well, we're not going to help Russia kill Ukrainians. Well, it looks like they're doing exactly that. So they're helping them on the combat, so actually offensive attacks on Ukraine. We know that look, there's an axis now. You've got China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia all working together.
What a terrifying axis that is.
Yeah, well, it's part of what you're talking about is this new global world order and the new Cold War, which is going to be led by China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
What do you make of 100 Chinese nationals trying to get into U.S. military bases, appearing as tourists and saying, hey, all have the same story? What is with that?
It's like they're coming in through the doors and the walls and the crack in the floor. Yeah, the Chinese are clearly penetrating United States intelligence. It started with the spy balloon, probably started before that. They're looking at us from Cuba. They've got divers that are going off of U.S. naval installations. They've got tourists going into hotels that are near American military installations. I mean, they even have White House tours where Chinese tourists are, quote, getting lost and taking pictures of areas they're not supposed to take. I think a lot of this is just the whole Chinese approach to intelligence is hoover up as much as you can. We'll figure out what we'll use it for later. But yes, and it's also in your face. They're not even trying to disguise it.
Okay, so what will need to happen to end this war? Because no one's talking peace right now.
No one's talking peace, and the only one who's talking victory is Putin. You don't see NATO talking victory. In fact, the Pentagon has taken the word victory out of its 400-page dictionary of military terms. So if we don't have an idea of what victory is, and at what point is it in our interests to proceed, and at what one point is it against our interests to proceed, then we have no plan. Now, you think Putin doesn't know this? So why shouldn't he just go ahead and proceed as he wishes? Because he knows. I mean, look at the people running the White House now.
Let's just pull out a map for you. This is Havana, where the Russian fleet will be docking. And this is Miami, the closest American city. The air distance between Havana and Miami is barely 366 kilometers. Zircon, like we told you, can travel up to 1,000 kilometers, meaning it can strike as far as South Carolina. Let's look at another missile that can be launched from the Russian warship docking in Havana, the Caliber missile. It has a much larger range. It can hit targets that are as far as 2,500 kilometers, meaning it is capable of striking New York, Washington, D.C., Dallas, St. Louis, even Chicago. You realize why this is a huge story? This is essentially Putin telling the West that his threats are not empty.
You and I are commanded by God to be salt and light until the end. That means we are to be involved in everything for the cause of Christ, no matter what it is. If you are in the police, law enforcement field, be there for Jesus. If you are a chef at a restaurant, be there for Jesus. If you're on the football field, be there for Jesus. In the office, at home, be there for Jesus. These are the last days. Yes, all these things that we're seeing right now should cause us to be motivated. Please get this, and I'm going to go away in a second. Let these things be motivators, not something that causes you to sequester yourself. Motivators. Oh my gosh, the world's falling apart. Get up and give the gospel. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Repent and trust God. But by all means, these are amazing days. Friends, be ready. Because listen, we may not have an America for long as we know it, but the kingdom of God is not shaken by any of these things.